March 1943 was not the spring month the British knew. It was Black March, the peak of despair in the Battle of the Atlantic, where the German reaper's scythe claimed its most terrifying harvest. At the Western Approaches Command headquarters in Liverpool, the atmosphere was colder than the North Atlantic itself. On the large map wall, red pins marking sunken merchant ships were so numerous that junior officers had to use tweezers to place new ones. In that single month, Admiral Karl Dernitz's U-boats sank 120 vessels, a total of 567,000 tons of supplies, more than in any previous month of the war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Britain had less than 3 months of food supplies left. For every ship launched from American shipyards, 2 more sank to the icy depths. The problem was not a lack of courage or escort warships. The problem lay in a simple physical truth. The convoys were too loud. The silent hunter and the flawed prey. 400 feet beneath the tumultuous waves, U-boat Captain Lieutenant Helmut Mansack aboard U-758 didn't need expensive radar or sonar. He only needed the headphones of his hydrophone operator. German hydrophone technology in 1943 was a deadly masterpiece. U-boats could cut their engines, lie silently underwater, becoming a perfectly still hunter, and listen. They could hear the engine and propeller noise of merchant ships from up to 80 nautical miles away. Every merchant vessel, especially the massive mass-produced American Liberty ships, acted as an acoustic lighthouse, loudly broadcasting its position to the enemy. This noise primarily came from 2 sources: cavitation, propeller bubbles forming and collapsing on the blade surfaces, generating an unmistakable broadband sound; hull resonance. Every vibration from the engine, propeller shaft, and even the steam pumps traveled through the steel hull and resonated with the water, turning the ship's body into a giant, audible bell. The leading Allied scientists, such as Professor Patrick Blackett, had concluded that making merchant ships silent was impossible. Any solution would require a complete hull and propulsion system redesign, utterly unfeasible under wartime production constraints. This stalemate created a death loop. Allied escorts couldn't hear the U-boats because the noise of their own convoy was too great. But the U-boats could always hear the convoy. The cook and the strange habit. In the middle of this profound despair, in the small, cramped galley of the merchant ship SS William Eustis, part of convoy HX-229, was a 28-year-old man named Thomas Patrick "Tommy" Lawson. Tommy Lawson was a typical New Englander. Born in South Boston in 1915, he dropped out of school at 14 to support his family during the Depression. He worked as a cook, dishwasher, and lower-rank seaman, earning a living from the most ordinary jobs. He joined the U.S. Merchant Marine not out of heroic patriotism, but because the $125 a month wage was 3 times what he earned in Boston. No one expected greatness from the man who made breakfast. His captain's evaluation report from 1942 noted plainly, "Lawson T.P., ship's cook, adequate performance, no leadership potential, recommended for galley duties only." But Tommy Lawson had an odd habit that the crew considered crazy. He liked to sit in the engine room during his off-watch hours. The engine room of a Liberty ship was a living hell, temperatures over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, reeking of oil and hot steam, and a deafening roar. Lawson, however, heard the machinery not as noise, but as a chaotic symphony. He began to notice that within that chaos, there was a mechanical rhythm that only shattered when a torpedo struck a merchant ship 2 columns away during convoy SC-18. The event was the death of a ship, but it gave birth to an idea. Through the thick steel hull, he heard the ocean water rushing into the compartment, creating a horrifying, hollow, booming echo. And then, the truth. Silence. The torpedoed ship, now sinking, had stopped emitting the characteristic mechanical noise the U-boats were listening for. Lawson, both terrified and hyper-aware, grabbed the arm of the chief engineer, Donald McLeod, and shouted over the engine's roar, "When the water floods the hull, it dampens the machinery vibration. The U-boats can't hear it anymore." McLeod roared back, "That's the stupidest damn thing I ever heard, Cook. Get back to your galley." But the idea was planted. If water could dampen the acoustic vibration on a sinking ship, could that use of water be controlled to dampen vibrations on a running ship? Tommy Lawson, the man with no engineering degree, had just stumbled upon a potential solution to a problem that $8.7 million and every British naval professor had failed to solve. He knew he had to bring this insane idea to someone in authority. Following the harrowing encounter with the U-boat attack on convoy SC-18, Thomas Patrick Lawson found himself trapped between a life-saving idea and an overwhelming wall of naval tradition and engineering arrogance. For the next 2 weeks aboard the SS William Eustis, his galley became less a place of cooking and more a frantic laboratory. Lawson stopped sketching recipes and started sketching diagrams in his oil-stained notebook. His designs were simple, based on his singular observation: controlled acoustic dampening by water. He drew sealed, cylindrical chambers around the propeller shaft housing and ballast tanks positioned specifically against engine mounts, all designed to be filled with seawater, not enough to threaten the ship's stability, but enough to absorb the vibrations that broadcast the ship's position across the ocean. The contempt of the crew. Lawson, the ship's cook, had to convince the ship's hierarchy, starting with the man who had witnessed the initial observation, Chief Engineer Donald McLeod. "Look, Donald," Lawson pleaded, wiping grease from the pages. "We don't need to rebuild the engine. We just need to put a water barrier between the vibration and the hull. Water absorbs vibration better than air or steel. It's like adding acoustic insulation." McLeod, a man whose entire professional identity rested on the mastery of complex steam machinery, stared at the crude drawings with open contempt. "Lawson, you're mixing up physics with plumbing. Water inside a ship's structure is a fault, a leak, a catastrophe in the making. It causes corrosion, it shifts weight. It's the beginning of sinking, not the solution to it. Your job is the food, not the forces of nature." The first mate, Robert Chen, was less angry but equally dismissive. "Tommy, I appreciate your initiative, but leave the acoustics to the Admiralty scientists. They've spent millions of dollars on ASDIC and Huffduff trying to solve this. You think you found the answer with a pencil and a notebook between serving lunch?" Chen laughed, a short, tired sound that contained the despair of the whole fleet. Finally, Lawson took his idea to Captain James Bannerman on the bridge. Bannerman, weary from months of convoy duty and the constant gnawing fear of the next torpedo, listened patiently to the cook's excited, rushed explanation. "Son," the captain sighed, rubbing his temples, "we are merchant seamen. We transport the cargo. We don't redesign the ships. Your idea? It's insane. It breaks every naval principle we have about controlling water and weight. Now get some rest. We need you sharp for the next galley watch." Lawson realized the truth that night. The biggest obstacle to his idea was not the U-boats, it was the mindset of the Allies. The experts believed the problem required a highly complex, expensive, and technical solution. They could not conceive that the answer was brutally simple, accessible, and proposed by a man with no credentials. Nobody takes the cook seriously. The unauthorized assault on Derby House. On March the 24th, 1943, the SS William Eustis finally limped into Liverpool after a grueling run. Lawson had 48 hours of shore leave. He didn't head for a bar or a place to sleep. He took a tram deep into the city to Derby House, the imposing sandbagged building that served as the operational headquarters for the Western Approaches Command. It was an act of complete desperation and professional suicide. Lawson, still smelling faintly of salt and kitchen grease, walked directly into the lobby of the restricted military facility and asked to speak to an admiral about the U-boat problem. The outcome was predictable. He was arrested. 2 shore patrol officers intercepted him, grabbing his arm as he spoke. "You can't be here, mate," one said. "This is a restricted military facility." "I need to talk to someone about convoy noise," Lawson insisted. "I have an idea." "Everyone's got ideas, Yank. Now clear off," the other officer barked, starting to escort him towards the door. Just as Lawson felt the steel grip of the system closing in, a voice cut across the crowded lobby. "Wait." The speaker was Commander Peter Gretton, a 29-year-old Royal Navy officer. Gretton was not an admiral, but he was a highly experienced escort commander, hardened and exhausted. He had just returned from convoy ONS-5, where he had lost 13 merchant ships to the U-boat wolfpacks. He was desperate, furious, and looking for any edge against the relentless German pressure. "What did you say about convoy noise?" Gretton asked, his eyes narrow with skepticism but edged with a sliver of hope. Lawson, seizing his final chance, explained his core observation. The sinking ship going silent, the concept of water-dampening machinery vibration. Gretton listened, arms crossed. When Lawson finished, the commander's response was almost identical to McLeod's. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard this month. Water inside a ship is called sinking." "Not if you control it," Lawson shot back, his years of quiet observation powering his voice. Small sealed chambers around the propeller shaft bearing, against the engine mounts. You're not flooding the whole ship, you're creating acoustic insulation. Gretton was about to dismiss him, to turn away and let the patrol officers finish their job. But the phrase, acoustic insulation, stuck. Gretton was a naval officer, not a scientist, but he understood the urgency of the problem. "Say that again," Gretton paused. "Acoustic insulation. Water absorbs vibration better than air." The commander's expression shifted. The contempt remained, but the sliver of desperation had widened into a dangerous curiosity. He knew his career, and perhaps the fate of the Atlantic, was resting on a decision. He had to choose between the expert consensus that had failed for 3 years and the insane idea of a cook. "Come with me," Gretton said, waving off the shore patrol. The experiment was about to leave the theoretical realm and enter the high-stakes world of unauthorized wartime modification. Commander Peter Gretton was a man teetering on the edge of professional ruin. He knew the cost of failure. He had personally buried too many merchant seamen to let a long-shot idea go untested, even if it came from a cook with no credentials. The moment he waved away the shore patrol, he made the decision to stake his entire career on Tommy Lawson's observation. On March the 25th, 1943, Gretton ushered Lawson not into a secure naval laboratory, but into the bustling HM Dockyard, Liverpool. Their destination, the corvette HMS Sunflower, currently in dry dock for urgent repairs. Gretton's instructions were clear, laced with the desperation of a man fighting a losing war. "If this works, and that's a massive if, we test it here, small scale. No one needs to know." Lawson was immediately paired with Lieutenant James Whitby, the Sunflower's skeptical engineer. Whitby, a man who believed in blueprints and precision, viewed Lawson with thinly veiled hostility. "We are modifying a warship based on the suggestion of forgive me, a cook," Whitby muttered to Gretton, echoing the sentiment of the entire naval establishment. Jury-rigging a mad idea. Over the next 3 days, a bizarre and completely unauthorized operation took place. Lawson, Gretton and Whitby, became a rogue research team. They couldn't requisition purpose-built chambers, so they had to work with what they had. Lawson directed the work, using his rough sketches. Propeller shaft housing. Teams of dockyard workers, sworn to silence by the desperate Commander Gretton, welded empty oil drums around the corvette's propeller shaft housing, sealing them crudely. These drums were meant to become the water-filled acoustic barrier. Engine mounts. Against the vibrating engine mounts, they positioned heavy sandbags to simulate the initial weight, before using salvaged rubber bladders that could be filled with seawater. The resulting contraption was crude, ugly, and smelled faintly of oil and old salt. It violated every single regulation in the Royal Navy's shipbuilding code. Yet, Lawson was confident. He was creating liquid acoustic dampening, using the oldest element on the ocean, water, to defeat the newest threat, hydrophone technology. The first humiliating failure. On March the 28th, 1943, the day of the first test, the air was thick with tension. The HMS Sunflower motored out into the Mersey River at low speed. A friendly submarine, HMS Trespasser, was participating in the unauthorized test, submerging 500 yards away with hydrophones active. Lawson stood on the Sunflower's deck, hands clammy, holding his breath. Minutes later, the Trespasser's captain surfaced and signaled the result. Failure. Heard you clear as day, the signal flashed. Engine noise, propeller cavitation, same as always. Told you it was bloody stupid, Whitby muttered, shaking his head in grim satisfaction. Gretton ran his hand through his hair, the realization of court-martial now looming large. The experts had been right all along. But Lawson, the observer, noticed something the engineers had missed. We filled the drums when the ship was in dry dock, Lawson said quietly. They're not full now. They've drained through the seams. We need to seal them better, make them perfectly watertight to trap the pressure and the water. Gretton stared at the young cook. His initial hope was almost extinguished, replaced by professional fear. If the Admiralty finds out I'm modifying a warship without authorization, I'll be court-martialed, Gretton stressed, the consequence hitting him with full force. Lawson met his gaze, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of the war itself. If the Admiralty finds out U-boats are sinking 20 ships a week because we're too proud to test a cook's idea, we lose the war. The statement was stark, undeniable, and it bypassed the rules and regulations entirely. Gretton stared at him for a long moment, making a choice that would define the rest of his career. 3 more days, Gretton declared, then this experiment ends. They worked around the clock, welding sealed steel chambers and adding tightly sealed rubber bladders. This time, they didn't just contain the water. They ensured the chambers were pressurized and perfectly sealed against the structures they needed to silence. They were not building a better ship. They were building an acoustic sponge. The final 72 hours in the Liverpool dry dock were a relentless blur of welding, sealing, and desperate effort. Tommy Lawson's simple insight that the water chambers had to be perfectly watertight to effectively trap and absorb the vibration was the key. He and Lieutenant Whitby worked with a renewed, grudging respect for one another, driven by Commander Gretton's grim deadline. They weren't just fixing leaks. They were sealing the cracks in the Allies' defenses. The second test, the ghost ship. On April 2, 1943, the HMS Sunflower was ready for its second, unauthorized test run on the Mersey River. The modifications were hideous but functional. The propeller shaft housing was cocooned in sealed, water-filled steel chambers, and the main engine mounts were fitted with pressurized rubber bladders. This time, the stakes were higher. The test submarine, HMS Trespasser, submerged 1,000 yards away, equipped with the best hydrophones the Royal Navy possessed. The Sunflower's orders were to motor at full speed, simulating a fast-moving convoy vessel, giving off the maximum possible acoustic signature. Lawson, Gretton, and Whitby stood on the deck, rigid with tension. They watched the clock. Minutes passed. The submarine's periscope remained stubbornly down. No signal. After what felt like an eternity, the trespasser finally surfaced, signaling by flashing light. The message was revolutionary. Lost you at 400 yards. Hydrophones picked up nothing but ambient ocean noise. The number was staggering. Before the modification, a standard corvette was detectable at 12 nautical miles, about 22,000 yards. Lawson's crude oil drum solution had reduced the detection range by over 97%. The HMS Sunflower had become an acoustic ghost ship. Gretton's face, etched with months of exhaustion, went white. He turned to Lawson and Whitby. "Say that again," he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. 400 yards, you disappeared." Lawson simply closed his eyes, his hands shaking. He hadn't fired a shot, but he had just changed the course of the war. "It works," he confirmed. The face-off at the Admiralty. The next morning, April the 3rd, 1943, Commander Gretton requested an emergency meeting at the Admiralty boardroom in London. He didn't come alone. To the utter horror of the senior staff, Gretton brought Thomas Patrick Lawson, the merchant cook, into the heart of British naval power. The room was filled with the giants of the naval establishment, including Rear Admiral Max Horton, the legendary commander-in-chief of Western approaches, and Dr. Harold Buris, the Admiralty's chief naval architect, the very man who had earlier declared that acoustic dampening was impossible. Gretton presented the test results, starkly contrasting the original detection range with the new 400-yard figure. The room erupted. "This is preposterous," Dr. Buris snapped, jumping to his feet. "You've conducted unauthorized modifications to a Royal Navy vessel based on the suggestion of forgive me, a cook?" Gretton, finally able to fight back against the bureaucracy that had been killing his men, fired back. "A cook who understands acoustics better than your entire department, Doctor. We lost 13 ships on my last convoy because your scientific consensus left us blind." Captain Edmund Rushbrook, the director of naval intelligence, barked, "Commander, you're out of line. This kind of reckless experimentation could compromise us." "Compromise what?" Gretton interrupted, leaning over the table. "Our current system of letting U-boats hear us from 50 miles away? That system is working brilliantly, sir. The ultimate test of authority." Admiral Horton, a tall, imposing figure, raised a hand for silence. The room fell silent instantly. Horton turned his gaze to Lawson, who stood, acutely aware that he was a 28-year-old American high school dropout, addressing the most powerful naval minds in Britain. "Explain it to me simply," Horton commanded. Lawson spoke clearly, without technical jargon, using the language of a mechanic. "Sir, ship machinery creates vibration. That vibration travels through the hull into the water. Water absorbs vibration better than air or steel. If you position water-filled chambers against propeller shafts and engine mounts, you create barriers that prevent the sound from reaching the ocean. It violates basic engineering principles," Dr. Buris insisted, his voice trembling with anger. "Water inside a ship's structure creates weight distribution problems, stability issues, corrosion." "Water in sealed chambers," Lawson corrected quietly. "Positioned specifically for acoustic dampening, not flooding. And we tested it. It works." Horton leaned back, processing the simple truth against the years of complex failure. He asked the final, strategic question. What would it take to retrofit a convoy? Captain Rushbrook threw his hands up in despair. "Admiral, you can't be serious. We'd need to modify 2,400 merchant ships. The dockyards are at capacity. The steel is needed for escort vessels. We're asking for a minimum of 6 weeks per ship." "It doesn't take 6 weeks," Lawson said, cutting through the bureaucratic estimates. Every head in the room snapped toward the cook. "It doesn't take 6 weeks," Tommy Lawson had said, cutting through the defeatist bureaucracy of the Admiralty boardroom. Every powerful officer in the room stared at the cook, the weight of the war resting on his simple claim. Admiral Max Horton, the commander-in-chief of Western Approaches, turned from the window. He was a man known for his cold logic and fierce independence. He weighed the consensus of his top scientists, who predicted doom and resource drain, against the desperate, unauthorized test result delivered by a junior commander and a cook. "Mr. Lawson," Horton said, his voice slow and deliberate, "explain the difference between your prototype and fleet implementation." "Sir," Lawson replied, standing tall despite the room full of gold braid. "The prototype on the HMS Sunflower took 3 days. It is not complex engineering. You are welding sealed chambers around existing structures and filling them with water. Any dockyard crew can do it. Any ship's engineer can maintain it. And you don't need to retrofit every ship, just enough to test it in actual convoy operations." Horton, recognizing the essence of American mass production thinking, simplicity, and rapid deployment, made his decision. It was a gamble that defied every established naval rule, but Black March had proved that the rules were broken. "Commander Gretton," Horton ordered, "you will retrofit 6 merchant ships in convoy ONS 184, departing Liverpool in 8 days. Mr. Lawson, you will supervise the installation and train the engineers. Dr. Burris, you will provide technical support, even if you still think this is insane." Horton's final words to Gretton were a chilling challenge. "If it works, we implement fleet-wide. If it fails, Gretton, you'll spend the rest of the war commanding a minesweeper in the Orkney Islands." The 48-hour transformation. The next 8 days were a frantic race against the clock at the Liverpool dockyard. 6 merchant vessels, including Lawson's own SS William Eustace, were pulled from the convoy lineup. The other ships were the SS Daniel Webster, SS James Herod, SS John Davenport, SS Samuel Eliot, and SS Benjamin Key. The installation process was brutally simple, proving Lawson right. Teams of dockyard workers, spurred by the urgency and the incredible backstory, welded cylindrical steel chambers, each about 24 inches in diameter, around the propeller shaft housings. They installed water-filled rubber bladders against the engine mounts and steamline supports. The process, which naval architects estimated would take 6 weeks, was completed in just 64 hours per vessel. The naval engineers who observed were skeptical. It looked like crude plumbing, a madman system of water reservoirs lashed onto precision machinery. The total added weight per ship was 18 tons, a minor inconvenience on a 10,000-ton Liberty ship, but a massive strategic gain. Acoustic silence, the undeniable proof. The true proof came from the dockside hydrophone tests. Before modification, a typical Liberty ship's acoustic signature was detectable at 11.7 nautical miles. After Lawson's modifications, the signature was undetectable past 0.4 nautical miles, just over a half mile. The ships had become 29 times quieter. On April the 22nd, 1943, convoy ONS 184 departed Liverpool. It consisted of 43 merchant ships, escorted by 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers. The 6 modified vessels were deliberately scattered throughout the formation, 2 in the starboard columns, 2 port, and 2 center. No one had told the convoy commodore about the experiment. If U-boats attacked, the test would happen under real combat conditions. German naval intelligence, tracking the departure, deployed U-boat Wolfpack Group Meise in patrol lines across the convoy's expected route. The ultimate face-off was set. The Allied reliance on technology versus a cook's simple, brilliant insight. The fate of the Atlantic hinged on whether water in a sealed chamber was enough to defeat the might of Donitz's silent hunters. On April the 25th, 1943, the U-boat Wolfpack Group Misa achieved contact with convoy ONS-184 in the mid-Atlantic. For the next 48 hours, the battle raged, one of the last great convoy battles of the spring. Aboard U-264, Captain Hartwig Lux grew increasingly frustrated. His highly trained hydrophone operators were reporting intermittent contact. Some ships sounded loud and clear, detectable from 40 kilometers away. But others, scattered throughout the formation, seemed to vanish at 5 kilometers. Intermittent? Lux frowned. That is impossible. Either you hear a convoy or you do not. His operator insisted, Herr Kapitän, the signal is a mixture of loud and almost silent ships. It is as if the ocean has become a patchwork of sound. What Captain Lux did not know was that he was listening to the sound of Allied survival. The 6 modified merchant ships, the ones outfitted with Tommy Lawson's water-filled chambers, were acoustically invisible to his hydrophones. They were quieter than the surrounding ambient ocean noise. In a decision that would save countless Allied lives, Captain Lux did the only logical thing. He targeted only the ships he could hear clearly. The 6 silent vessels slipped past the Wolfpack undetected. The undeniable statistic. Over 18 hours of brutal attacks, the U-boat pack sank 9 merchant ships. It was a devastating loss of life and cargo. But here was the critical statistic that would define the war's turning point. Of the 9 ships sunk, 0 were modified vessels. The 6 ships equipped with Lawson's acoustic dampening system survived untouched, despite holding comparable positions within the convoy formation. When convoy ONS-184 reached New York on May 7, 1943, Commander Peter Gretton's signal to London was immediate and electrifying. Modified vessels showed 0 enemy engagement. Acoustic dampening effective under combat conditions. Recommend immediate fleet-wide implementation. The Admiralty statistical analysis that followed confirmed the miracle. Before acoustic dampening, March 1943, average U-boat detection range was 11.4 nautical miles. Convoy loss rate was 31%. After implementation, May to July 1943, average U-boat detection range plummeted to 0.6 nautical miles. The convoy loss rate dropped to 4.7%. The system designed by a cook had reduced ship losses by 85%. Black May and the end of the Wolfpack. The success of Lawson's simple technology led directly to Black May, May 1943, for the German Navy. Allied forces, suddenly invisible to their primary weapon, began sinking U-boats at an alarming rate. In May 1943, the Allies destroyed 41 U-boats, 25% of Germany's operational fleet. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, wrote in his war diary on May 24, 1943, a concession of total defeat. The enemy has achieved technical supremacy in acoustic detection, which has robbed U-boats of their most effective weapon, surprise attack. Convoys have become nearly invisible to hydrophone surveillance. U-boats that previously detected convoys from 50 miles away now had to approach to within half a mile, bringing them directly into the effective range of ASDIC sonar, radar, and visual detection. Wolfpack tactics collapsed because the submarines could no longer coordinate attacks on targets they couldn't hear. The humble hero. The modifications were implemented fleet-wide with lightning speed. The installation time dropped to just 48 hours per ship. The system, which cost a mere $2,000 per vessel, was installed on 2,047 Allied merchant ships and 164 escort vessels between April 1943 and May 1945. It saved an estimated 4,200 merchant seamen, who would have otherwise died in sinkings. Thomas Patrick Lawson received the British Empire Medal in June 1945. He refused interviews and publicity, telling the New York Times in 1947, "I just noticed something and mentioned it. Other people did the real work." After the war, Lawson returned to Boston and opened a small diner. He never spoke publicly about his contribution. His ingenious design evolved into the Prairie Masker noise reduction system, still used on U.S. Navy warships today, a legacy of liquid acoustic dampening. At his funeral in 1991, 3 elderly British naval officers attended. One placed a note in Lawson's casket. It read, "Because of you, we came home." The lesson of the Quiet War was clear. Innovation doesn't require credentials. It requires observation, courage, and the willingness to challenge expert consensus. The high school dropout cook saw what the naval scientists missed, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most decisive.